Okay, this is a presentation about autism spectrum disorders. And what we're going to be covering here is an issue around the pathogenesis, which we'll explain, it's a term I'll explain, and really the neurological aspect of ASD, autism spectrum disorders, which is the new name for autism, PDD, and Asperger's syndrome that is going to be in the new diagnostic manual. So let's get started. Well, what we know is that people with ASD can be very different from one another. And Jones and Klin, in a very important article, discussed this. And what they said was that despite common areas of impairment, we're going to talk about them, that define autism or ASD as a condition, people with autism are very, very different. And what they talk about is the expression and severity of symptoms. And the differences they talk about are IQ, language, communication, social, behavioral disabilities. But it even goes farther than that. There's so many differences in people with the same diagnosis that even in a chart like this, we're only looking at a representative sample of the types of problems that are not universal. Remember, this chart is showing us, things that are not necessarily going to be found in a person and aren't needed for the diagnosis of autism spectrum disorders. So they're not universal. And a lot of these are going to surprise people. Even professionals are sometimes surprised by some of the things that are not universally found in ASD. So remember, this is just a representative sample. Why this is so is because ASD is what we call a pathogenic disorder. Okay? And we have to distinguish between two things. One is etiology, and that's the cause of a disorder. And sometimes we get those two confused, that what we're learning in modern medicine, we've learned for a while now, is that there are many disorders, cancer is a good example, where there isn't ever going to be a single cause. Even in a certain person, even in one person, there isn't going to be a single cause. And especially when we look over a group of people, they may reach the same cancer. They may wind up with the same cancer and the same course of cancer from many different reasons, genetically different reasons, environmentally different reasons. And so when we talk about disorders like that, we're talking about what we call pathogenic disorders. And that just means they have a common thing about the word pathway and pathogenic. They have a common pathway. So they can start out from many different causes and contributions, multiple contributions. But at some point, to receive this diagnosis, people have merged onto a common pathway. So when we talk about pathogenesis, there's my little brain with sneakers on, moving off this pathway. It explains why, despite many different starting points, and when we think about etiology as a starting point, at some time, and we believe this during the first 18 months of life, although in rare cases that may be later, every child who's going to be diagnosed later with ASD is going to leave a pathway, a type of pathway, and we'll talk about the pathway of typical neural brain development. Their brains are not going to develop as we would hope they would. They stop developing in a certain way, in a certain critical way. And even more concerned, they don't return. This is not temporary. This is not just a delay. This is just not a hiatus or a break. This appears from the research to be, if left, as it is, to be a permanent loss of development. And Minshew and Williams, in a very important article, talked about this and looked at the research, and this has just been confirmed over the last 5 years. And you're going to see that they talk about the higher level frontal lobe skills, that don't seem to develop in the same way. They don't develop in people with ASD throughout life. Okay, and the word that scientists use for this failure of development, this pathway that all people with ASD seem to get off of, is the term neural complexity. And as you can see from the slide, it's considered a hallmark of healthy brain development. It's what we hope we see in everybody's brain development, every child's neural development. And some of the problems that research have found, and this is just a very small sample, are, and we'll talk about these a little bit, limited processing center integration. The brain can be thought of as a number of different centers for processing different information. And for them to work effectively, they have to have some way to integrate and collaborate. Impaired mental resource allocation. What that means is that our mental resources are finite. The things we can consciously focus on and engage with are just limited. We can't be focused. We have to really be careful about how we use our mental resources. And usually a part of the brain called the prefrontal cortex, or usually thought of as the executive part of the brain, is continually deciding. We're deciding what part of our internal or external environment, what problems, what tasks should we be expending those mental resources on. Right? And part of that is information filtering and prioritizing. So we prioritize certain information as important, and we rapidly get rid of, there's so much information that we have to rapidly filter out. Okay? And then another thing is that what our brain does, what our executive center does, is determine what level of processing to do. We try to determine the higher levels of processing, more conscious, mindful processing, requires much more mental energy, is much more limited. So to be efficient, what the brain tries to do is to determine what kinds of information, what kinds of problems and tasks to expend that high-level energy on, the high-level integration. And what we see in ASD is that people, when it's needed, when they actually are presented with problems and tasks that should be where the brain should be now relying on the high-level integration, they tend to over-rely on the lower-level, less integrated processing. This next slide here that you're seeing is just one study that was done back a few years ago. And you can see that the research isn't always so perfectly clear-cut. It's not that people with ASD show no brain activity. This is prefrontal areas, if you see on the left, and you see on the right. So this is people with ASD, and these are both people with normal IQ. And you can see IQ is not the issue, intelligence. But one of the things you can see is that there are certain places in the brain, and you can see much more activation, and that's what we're looking for, is activation in the brain. It's subtle, right? But you can see that it's larger in people. And this is on a sentence comprehension task, which should be requiring, again, that high-level neural integration. And you can see there's more integration. Interestingly enough, you can see more activation here, and these are actually working together in these centers. You can see here, we're seeing nothing going on in the group with ASD down the lower left. No activation at all in this center of the frontal cortex. And why? Why is it that people share this common pathogenesis? What is it that makes people with ASD unique in this? And as I said, the issue is going to be around neural complexity, that they fail to develop neural complexity. That executive system, that coordination of different processing centers, the decision-making about filtering and prioritizing information, all that is, when we look at that together, scientists use the term neural complexity. So why do they fall off the pathway of neural complexity? So let's learn a little bit about neural complexity. So we see at birth, human infants are not born with neural complexity. It's not something you have. You have the potential for it, but you're not born with it. Rather, you're born with a lot of processing centers that are not yet linked up in a unique way. And the beauty of this, of course, is that depending on the culture you're living in, depending on the environment then, it can be, the brain is then flexible. We can be developing to adapt to different demands and different environments through our upbringing. But even though we have an enormous amount of processing, they're not linked. With infants, there's very poor filtering. They're just learning how to filter out information. Right? But over time, what happens is that what we hope through neural complexity development is that our brain will develop highly integrated neural superhighways. All right? Just think about the most complex interchange of superhighways connecting very critical processing areas, such as your emotional centers and your more analytic processing, but also connecting them around specific applications in the world of specific problems and tasks and situations, so that they're not just, randomly connected. They're integrated for adapting to the world that we're living in. This is the part of the brain we call the prefrontal cortex. By the end of the first year, scientists see that it is more frequently activated. In a newborn infant, we see very little prefrontal activation. The infant is really trying to get the lower centers of the brain, the more basic perceptual sensory centers of the brain, to work. But once we see enough development there, we start to see more reliance on the prefrontal cortex. More information is being routed through that, and more of the brain's decision-making about how allocating resources, how complex the processing should be, are occurring through the prefrontal cortex. Now, that never becomes the entire way we function. We always function on different levels. But by the end of the first year, we're seeing the amount of activity in the prefrontal area is becoming more like it would be in an older child or adult. So here you see that the cortex, is blocking out competing environmental information, competing internal ideas. This would be an older person, of course, not a baby, and is preferentially decided to focus on an anticipated opportunity for something, and then is directing these mental processes which require a high level of integration, like conditional planning, mental previewing, self-evaluation. These are very high-level things that require a lot of analysis, emotional information, episodic memory. So they're highly complex mental processes that are then directed in the service of this anticipated opportunity. So how does our brain develop this neural complexity that I've just been describing? That's the question. Now, one thing we have to be clear about is that our brain is what we call an experience-dependent organ. And you can see that from what I've been discussing, that it's what happens in the environment, right? How the brain is able to take advantage of opportunities is really the critical issue to develop in the environment. So what it takes, we're talking about two different issues. We're talking about the ability to be presented with opportunities, being presented with opportunities for growth, and then the ability to take advantage of those opportunities, to have the mental resources, the neural resources to use them for growth. So they really think of this as an interaction of those two things. Now, I want you to understand that growth is not going to occur unless the brain is challenged. Okay, because our brain is developed, and you can see our little exercising brain there, and I say, don't be fooled, our brain's lazy. It's not going to exercise unless it has to. And what that really implies here is that the way our brain's been designed is because our mental resources are so precious to us, our brain has been designed to look for the most efficient way of managing or adapting to the problems, the tasks, the environment that we deal with. So we look for the least, as I say, effortful way, the least effort to get the job done. So unless we're presented with challenging situations, our brain is not going to develop further. Okay, so if what we've got right now, the way the brain is working, is sufficient, it's not going to be pushed to develop. Brain has to really be pushed to develop. Okay, so the saying I have is here: neural complexity develops on a need plus ability to grow. So we have to be provided with productive challenge, and we have to have the ability to use that challenge, to see it as a challenge, of course, and to use it. So I have it here: our brain works to construct greater complexity, but only when it perceives that it faces new processing demands that are important enough to expend those resources on, challenging but not overwhelming. And we'll talk about that there's a range for each person, each human being, from infancy on, when we can perceive something as just a little bit above our current level of functioning, but not so much that it's overwhelming. So the concept of important, challenging, but not overwhelming is really, really critical. And you can see here in this graph. And what I say here is opportunities for greater neural complexity emerge when we actively engage with mental challenges. We see ourselves as engaging, not just passively, that fall within a productive range. And you see here this range of challenge. Challenges have to be great enough to drive neural growth. All right, here's a concept of an insufficient challenge, and the brain says, I can do this with what I've got already, but not so great that they lead to withdrawal. And of course, here we see the concept, if we go over that edge and it's perceived, we perceive this as overwhelming or threatening, that we might avoid a withdrawal, but we're not going to try to engage in a way that's going to stimulate growth. Okay, now we can look at this. Can we actually observe people? Can we observe infants in the process of neural growth, the growth of neural complexity? And the answer is yes, we actually can. And scientists use this term studying to show that that's a sign that neural complexity is being formed. And we see that as young as 7 months of age. And what that means is that we can actually see the physical and behavioral correlates of the brain perceiving a challenge and engaging with that challenge in a productive way. And the term is studying. So what do we see when we see an infant, let's say at 9-month-old or 10-month-old, their brain engaged in developing neural complexity? Well, first of all, there has to be a perception that I am uncertain about what to do, what something is, right? It's not completely meaningless. There has to be some what we call continuity with my past experience, but also some novelty. So I'm not quite sure. At the same time that I have that feeling of uncertainty, I don't feel any threat. I don't feel like what's creating that uncertainty is something I have to withdraw, avoid, something hurt me. I'm in the presence, typically if you're an infant, of a parent, a safe person you trust. And when we experience that, what we see physically is that the infant's heart rate lowers, breathing steadies, movement decreases, and attention is focused on the source of the uncertainty, to study it, literally. And so the body is actually responding to the need to conserve resources for neural development. And of course, then we'll see the prefrontal cortex becoming highly active if we were to measure that. And so these are all things that have been measured in infants. And we can really see this concept of studying. And what's interesting is we can see it throughout our lifespan, not just for infants. You can see it in yourself as well. Because we don't stop studying. Neural complexity, neural development, as we have learned in the last 20 years, can be a lifelong process. And so you can actually become aware of times when you struggle with a new idea, a new feeling, a new problem, something just a bit outside of your prior experience or knowledge, not too much. So you think you don't quite know it. It's sort of you have to stretch now. You're not quite sure. It's not scary. It's not threatening. It's not intense. But it's just somewhat not fitting in, not quite fitting in with your prior experience. And you'll find yourself, when you study, becoming physically and behaviorally quiet, just like the infant. Your heart rate will decrease. Your movement will decrease. You become less aware of the sensations around you. And as I said, this is your body's way of reserving energy for this intense mental activity. And you might want to try to do this sometime. You probably become aware, even through this presentation, of times when you are feeling a little challenged by the new ideas or new thoughts, and see that there's a real positive feeling when you do this. It's not a negative feeling. It's actually a very positive, reinforcing feeling when you're feeling challenged, and you're able to then get to that moment when you feel like you can transcend, when you can figure things out. It's very, very powerful in a very positive way. Now, that's the end of this presentation. In the next presentation, we're going to examine a little bit more how neural complexity does develop, but only with the aid of typically a parent guides. And we call that the guiding relationship.